Good day everyone, I am Jufali Bimautante. So in this video, we will tackle all about the effective communication of the organization. So communication is very important in human's life. With the use of communication, we can get some information about our surroundings or to our environment. Effective communication is an essential management tool in attaining the goals of the organization. In organization, it should have a unity and communication to achieve their goals. Communication can increase significantly decision-making effectiveness of a manager. It can serve as a guide to action in his analysis of the operational problems of the organization. A manager should have a staff specialist. The only question is just how they are going to work in relation to him. By depending too much in his staff specialist for his management decisions, he may not only be abdicating his communication function to them, but also his line authority to set the goals for the organization and to determine its pace of development. Such managerial action is easily understandable. Many of the organizational activities may be beyond manager's expertise, so he has to depend on them for studying each the myriad of the alternative plans in consideration of the operational situations of the organization. Apparently, there is no problem here. The staff specialists are supposed to assist the manager in the performance of his managerial function. In reality, however, the staff specialists are not only assisting the manager by providing him in the information he needs to make his decision, but rather they are making the decisions for him. Through the process of the complete staff work, the staff specialists may filter the data to suit their own purposes, if not their own value systems, priorities, or preoccupation. The manager in this particular situation loses his authority to consider the best course of his action in solving organizational or managerial problems. Decision making is the selection of best possible solution to a particular problem in a consideration of several alternatives. Decision making is one of the responsibility which a manager cannot delegate to anyone, regardless of their qualifications. Unless the manager uses communication as a tool of providing him the information needed for his important decisions, he cannot effectively perform his managerial functions. The communication process can be broken down into four elements. First is the sender, next is the message, the channel, and lastly is the receiver. So the effectiveness of the communication depends upon all of the four elements. Each of the components of the communication process can be defined as follows. The first element of the communication is the sender. In any forms of communication, the sender or the communicator starts the process. So, alam naman natin na ang sender ay ang bumubuo ng mensahe. At dito nagsisimula ang proseso ng isang komunikasyon. The sender may be an individual who is speaking, writing, or gesturing. Napakaraming paraan kung paano ipinahihiwatig ng isang sender ang kanyang mensahe. Pwede itong gamit ang pagsasalita, pagsusulat, o di kaya gamit ang kilos. It may be a group of people or a communication organization such as a newspaper plant, a television station, or a radio station. The second element of the communication is the message. The message is the information which the sender wishes his receiver to understand, accept, and act upon. So, ang pangalawang element ng komunikasyon ay ang mensahe. Ang mensahe ay ito ang impormasyong gustong ipahiwatig ng sender sa kanyang receiver. It is transmitted through a channel. It is expressed in a language understood by both the sender and the receiver. Napakahalaga na ang sender at ang receiver ay nagkakaunawaan hinggil sa lingwahe. Hindi naman pwedeng ang sender ay nagpahiwatig ng isang mensahe na hindi alam ng receiver kung anong lingwaheng ginamit ng sender. So the code of the message is the language. Its content is the ideas to be communicated, and its treatment is how the message is presented to the selected receiver. So the third element of the communication is the channel. The channel is the means by which a message gets across from a sender to receiver. Ang channel ito ay kung paano na ipadala ang mensahe ng sender sa kanyang receiver. It makes the message perceptible through the five senses. The channels of communication are ways of presenting messages so that they can be properly transmitted. They can be categorized as either interpersonal or mass media in nature. So there are two types of channel. First is the mass media. Channels are those means of transmitting messages that involves a mass medium such as newspaper, radio, television, film, and the like, which enable the sender to reach many receivers. Ang mass media, ito ay ang ginagamit na ang teknolohiya o gadgets sa pagpapahiwatig ng kanilang mensahe. Interpersonal channels are those that involve face-to-face exchange of messages between two or more individuals. Proper election and use of channels of communication varies with the types of audience and message. Ang interpersonal channels, ito ay yung harap-harapang mong nakakausap ang iyong receiver. So the last element of the communication is the receiver. It is known as the audience, decoder, or communicative. The receiver may be made up of an individual, a group, or a mass audience. Success in communication depends on what the recipient of messages does in response to messages received. Okay, so to communicate effectively, it is important to consider the following principles or guidelines. First, guidelines. The credibility of the communicator and the motives attributed to him have a profound influence on the reception of his message. Second is, the most successful communications are those which reinforce at least some of the audience beliefs, those which state conclusions as well as premises, and those which call for action. Third, people are interested first in people, then in things, last in ideas. Their attitudes and opinions are strongly influenced by the groups to which they belong or want to belong. Fourth, it is better to communicate information little by little over a period of time than all at once. Repeating a communication obviously prolongs its influence. Fifth, short sentences, familiar words, and active verbs helps make communications both interesting and persuasive. Next is, in changing opinion, oral presentation tends to be more effective than the written word. Next is, it is rarely possible for communication, particularly over the short range, to change deep-seated attitudes or beliefs. And lastly is mass communication alone is hardly ever an effective agent of change. In explaining the barriers to communication, Robert Prestos points out that a universal aspect of hierarchies is their tendency to stifle upward communication. Those in positions in leadership are often annoyed when they have to listen to the complaints of the subordinates. Even those who loudly proclaim that they maintain an open door, accessible at any time to all employees, become restive at expressions of discontent. Executives are human in that they do not like a bad news. Employee complaints are especially disturbing because they imply a criticism of management. They seem to suggest that the boss is not the wise, most humane, most beloved, and cleverest person in the organization. This naturally threatens his ego. For man made into a supervisor often sees himself as infallible. He wants others to confirm this picture of himself becomes irritated which they fail to do so. There are many other reasons why communication may fall. Certain types of communication do not go up the chain of command while others are hindered in going down. Some of the causes of failure in effective communication are as follows. First is deliberate shifting at various points along the line of command, sometimes by supervisors. Second is tendency of management people to underrate the intelligence and sophistication of the workers. Third is the cultural setting that fosters smugness, self-righteousness, and sycophancy. Fourth is the requisites of office and the glamour of status tend to impress the incumbent of the fact that he is a rather extraordinary sort of person and does not want to share his knowledge. Failure in interpersonal communication can be avoided if enough people can be brought to humble themselves and accept their limitations. They must also study and learn the principle of effective communication and make their application a continuing practice. Definition of communication exists and in diversity. Because of the dynamism of public administration, the definition of communication are bound to change further. Another reason for such change is the emerging nature of communication. Communication is not only an integral part of the management process, but it is management itself. As a system, it is two-way process. As such, both the sender and the receiver of the message must cooperate with each other to establish common understanding. Communication may be either informal or formal. In an organization, the formal communication is three-dimensional. First is the downward, next is the upward, and lastly is the horizontal. Communication is the lifeblood of the organization. Wherever there is a conflict and lack of understanding among people, there is also failure in communication. There are two types of communication: the interpersonal communication and mass communication. Communication may be either verbal and non-verbal. To communicate effectively, it is important to consider certain principles and guidelines on effective communication. There are many reasons why communication may fail. Certain types of communication do not go up the chain of command while others are hindered in going down. Failure in interpersonal communication can be avoided only by the people themselves by considering their individual limitations. So napakahalaga ng isang komunikasyon sa isang organisasyon. Kung walang komunikasyon, hindi nagkakaunawaan ang mga miyembro ng isang organisasyon. Okay, so that's all the effective communication of the organization. Thanks for watching.